All right, welcome back. We are working on Wafflebox, and we are working on our awesome drop-down menus, which now have our blur or click away functionality that's working really great. So let's take a look in this lesson at how we can also add our drop-downs to our menu navigation that appears up here, and how we're going to start to deal with having multiple drop-down components on the same page in our application. So in terms of actually adding this functionality up to this menu, that's a simple HTML change. So we'll go into our index.html file, and we'll sort of do the same thing we did here, where we added our data-dropdown, our ARIA expanded attributes, and we have our sort of drop-in and drop-down menu classes on the target element itself. So let's scroll up from this area here. We're going to find our menu, and you'll notice first of all that our menu is a little bit of a different HTML structure. It's a very typical unordered list menu structure that you would see often in many web applications. But we've actually already added the class equals dropdown. So there is our container for our two dropdowns. And of course, the two dropdowns are going to be waffles and waffle gifts. And what we want to do is make it so that whenever you click on the parent anchor, so in this case it's not a button, but it's actually an anchor, we want to make sure that it toggles the child drop-down menu, which appears right here. And then that means in both of these cases, we're going to copy the href, which is pointing to the ID of its target. And let's go over here to the end of the anchor, and we'll add data-dropdown equals, and we'll paste in that same selector right there. And we will also have ARIA expanded equals false as the default value. And now when we save that, you'll notice that by clicking on these, we are actually getting a drop-down menu. We also want to add our drop-in animation. So let's add drop-in. And then I might even, because these are kind of over towards the right side of the screen, I might even do an align right on that drop-down menu so that we kind of have a right aligned menu, just in case on smaller screens we get into a situation where we want to make sure that these appear a bit to the left. I'm going to darken the drop-down menu itself so it doesn't clash with the header style up here. So let's go into our drop-downs, and we'll just do a darken, I don't know, 5% on that background color. And then, yeah, that looks pretty good. So just a little bit of a contrast with the menu up above. You'll see our blur is still working great. But now now that we've implemented this in multiple places, you'll notice that we have a little bit of an issue here. So the issue is if I have an open dropdown and I click away, it is dismissing the dropdown, which is great. But you'll see here, if I have an open dropdown and then I click on another dropdown immediately, it's actually requiring me to click twice. So it did a dismiss on that click. And if I click again, it's actually going to open this one. And what's actually happening when we do this is our blur functionality is actually running multiple times, and it's even running whenever we click on an element. And that's a bit of an issue, because basically if you click here and you click away from there, it's not only going to run the blur method on this one, which is going to go to find all active ones and dismiss them, but it's also going to be simultaneously running the toggle method on this one up here. So what's happening is we're actually toggling waffles on, but then the blur method from choose a plan is blurring it back off, which is a little bit of an issue. So just a little bit of a timing thing in terms of the functionality, but it's actually pretty easy to fix because we already kind of have a method in place. You'll notice in our toggle script, we have, if you remember, we implemented this single option. And the single option, what it's going to do is before it even toggles the target or the button, it's going to go ahead and dismiss all of the other siblings. And we have the option to actually have the single container be the whole document. And I think that's for the case of a drop-down menu, that's actually preferable, because then you never want two drop-down menus to be displayed at any given time. And that will actually fix the issue, because whenever the blur on this runs, the single will actually already have run, because the whole timing of the way the click listeners are going to run, the single will actually already have dismissed choose a plan, and the blur will not run on that particular element because it will not have been active, and it will fix this issue. So simply just add single true, which is always a good idea with drop-down menus. And now you'll notice when I click here, I click up here, everything is working great with that single option. I can immediately toggle each of our individual drop downs on and off. It's going to dismiss the other ones through that single option. And then if I click away, then it's going to run a blur on those things. So basically what's happening is the dismissal of choose a plan is actually being handled through the single operation as opposed to the blur operation when you click on another drop down. And that's what we want so that we don't have that issue with the second click in order to toggle things on and off. And this is working pretty great. We've added this to multiple places in our application, and that is awesome. Great, so while we are here, let's talk a little bit about the responsive nature of this application. As I mentioned, it is a responsive application, as any website in modern web would expect to be. And whenever you are building your web interactions in a responsive application, I think it's really important to consider some specific scenarios where you may be tempted to duplicate functionality or change functionality based on the size of the screen. And just an example to just sort of explain what I'm getting at here. Let's just imagine that right now we have our main menu up here, and on a larger screen like we have here on a desktop or a tablet size screen, you would have a menu that functions with drop downs, as you can see here. And that's how it works on desktop. But let's just say that out of design requirements or client request, or just out of something that you thought of or the way you designed it, you decide that when you're on mobile, you no longer want drop downs. And not only that, maybe you want to have a toggle button that toggles this menu on and off, but that only affects the small screen experience. It does not affect the large screen experience that's right here. Maybe you want to transform this drop down functionality into something like an accordion, or maybe you want to disable it entirely whenever you're on a small screen and just have all the options listed out. There's lots of different scenarios where when you're doing a JavaScript interaction that's using click listeners to do stuff, you're also, because it is a responsive application, you're also simultaneously designing and building an interaction for touchscreens. And because these click events that you're listening for, that's also a touch, that's a tap on a smartphone or on a tablet or something like that. And so that mobile experience is something that's really important to think about when you're building these applications. And the biggest thing that I would caution against when doing this, and this is something I've done, it's probably something you've done if you've tried this before. I think everybody does it. But you may find yourself doing something where you may, for example, put in a toggle for this menu here. And let's actually do that. Let's start with this small screen experience here. And just as an example to kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about, let's put in a toggle for our menu. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this menu with something like div with a class of menu toggle. And so we'll have this outer div that's going to go around this whole unordered list. So let's go down to the /ul, tab that over, and we'll add a /div right before that. So we have a div that's around our UL with an ID of menu, and let's add a button above that. This will be a toggle button, so we'll say button.info, and this will just have the word menu in it. I didn't even plan on doing this. We're just kind of off the cuff. We're going to create a quick toggle here so we can follow my stream of consciousness wherever it happens to lead us. But let's just say, for example, I'm going to say create a data attribute called data menu toggle equals, and it's going to point to our menu down here. Right? So just a normal toggle. We're creating a toggle so that you can toggle the display of the menu on and off. It's going to have aria expanded equals false. So it'll be invisible by default. And when we save that, you'll see it adds a menu button up here. Do I have like a large? I don't have any. I don't know. I was going to style it up a little bit, but it doesn't matter. The idea is that maybe like when you're on a mobile screen, you have this menu button that you click on and it toggles that menu on and off. But whenever you go up to the large screen, maybe that changes. So we'll look at the large screen in a minute. Let's focus on this small screen experience. And you may find yourself saying, okay, we want to have this nice little thing that toggles the menu. So what we'll do is we'll go into our app.js. We'll create a toggle menu, const toggle menu equals new toggle. And we're going to set an attribute. What did I call that attribute? Data menu toggle. And then the container is going to be menu toggle, like up here. So the attribute is data menu toggle. The toggle container is menu toggle, like so. And so that should work. That should be functional now. So let's just double check inside of this menu toggle. I click, it's adding the active class on and off of our owner-ordered list. And now we would just have to go into something like menu.sass. Now let's go to the bottom and put small screen menu toggle. And we'll do was it toggle menu or menu toggle? Menu toggle, there it is, menu toggle. And just like we normally do on a toggle, when it's not active, we'll display none, something like that. So, whoops, no. I need to not display none the whole menu toggle, but just the menu itself. So let's change this to pound menu, like so. There we go. So now we can use this button to toggle the menu on and off, and we say, okay, that's great. Let's just pretend like we went through all the work of doing our CSS and we added a hamburger menu and all kinds of cool stuff. So we now have this toggleable menu, but the design requirement is that when we're on small screens, I want a menu toggle, but when we go to a large screen, I just want to display a normal menu. We have enough room on the large screen. I don't want to like have this view, right? Like that's an issue now, right? Because we have in the CSS, we've set display none on this target. And so when we go to a larger screen, we now have this, this pattern, this toggle pattern that we really only intend for small screens. And it's actually showing up on the large screen as well and affecting the presentation of our large screen menu, which is an issue in this case. And so again, I would say that it is, just to reiterate, it is better to have a single interaction that works across all screen sizes, because the nature of the web and the nature of web applications today is such that you don't know what device people are going to be on. They're going to be on all sorts of stuff. They're going to be on tablets, smartphones, computers, desktops. There are internet browsers on game consoles and Kindles, like e-readers, and I've seen them on refrigerators and treadmills. Like it's ridiculous the amount of devices that are internet connected in today's world, and you don't know. You want to make this something that's super flexible. And what we've basically done in this particular scenario is we've created this menu toggle, but we have now forced ourselves to kind of do twice the work, because we have two totally different functionalities of our menu. We have one functionality where we need to toggle the menu on and off on small screens. And then we have another functionality where the menu just is displayed and there is no toggle. And it's kind of like creating two totally different interactions. And in this case, it's the lack of an interaction on desktop and a small screen interaction. And that's twice the work, right? Especially if you were to say, if you were to do something like, I want drop downs on desktop, but when I go down to a small screen, I want that to be an accordion. That's a lot of work, because you're doing the same functionality twice, and it's so much easier to have a single interaction that works on all screens. And this reason is one reason in particular why I really like the off canvas sort of pop out from the left navigation pattern, because it works so well on everything from a smartphone in portrait mode up through a very large desktop screen. It works this, you can have it work identically on all of those devices, and it works great. Which is why I love that. But that's not always the case. You know, sometimes the client, if you're working with clients or you're working with an organization, you're working on a team, they come up with designs and requirements that, you know, you have to cater for as a developer. So that's why I'm going through this process and just kind of to address the scenario that's not a best case scenario, but it is a scenario we find ourselves in, where we have to basically do this work twice and kind of implement these patterns in ways that change across device screen sizes. And if you find yourself in this scenario where you're like, oh no, you know, how am I going to do this? I'm going to have to do all this work. You may initially reach for things like, okay, in the CSS, I can go and add a media query and kind of override all the stuff that this does. So, you may find yourself saying media min width screen medium. So we have some variables in our config.sass for screen sizes, responsive screen sizes. And I may say display block important or something like it. Use the awful important tag that you should never use in your CSS. Just an example. It's I'm basically like overriding. I'm kind of hacking it so that my interaction basically doesn't work whenever just using a media query. And this is a lot of work too. I don't recommend doing it this way because you're kind of doing an interaction and then you're undoing it in a media query. And that's kind of weird too. So if you do find yourself in the situation where you need to do this, I think a better scenario is to kind of separate it out. And so if you have a small screen interaction like this, where you want it to work like that, have the classes that are being applied in your toggle in this case only affect small screens. And then it doesn't even touch the desktop experience. So just as an example, you could have, in this case, instead of having this display none, we could take that out. And instead of having the active class, maybe we could create sort of a utility class that is in our app.js here. We can change the toggle class to active small, for example. So maybe this is an active class that is only applied on small screens, and suddenly we've kind of separated this functionality out from all the other interactions that may already be on that same component. And now that we have some separate classes and it's doing separate stuff than all the other interactions, we can go into our Sass file here. We can create a media query. So maybe we say max width screen small, screen medium, or whatever. And then with a max width one, it's never going to affect the desktop experience. I could say active small display block. And then I could say menu display none. Oh, we should probably put this inside there. Menu is going to be display none. And then, let's just use the same pattern we've always used, which is when it's not active small, we will display none. There we go. So now we have an active small class that is controlling the display of that. And if I toggle this off, it is currently display none, right? We have this display none, but because that's in a media query that's only affecting small screens, and because it's not, because it's a specific class that only our small screens care about, like it's not gonna butt heads if we had another interaction that's using the active class. It's not going to butt heads with that one because it's a totally separate class in this case. It's called active small. It's not just regular active. We're sort of scoping the presentation changes of this interaction to a single media query. And now when we go up to larger screens, you'll see that clicking on the menu has no effect on the menu itself. Clicking on this button up here, while it is still toggling active small on and off, the desktop screen doesn't care about that. Like the active small has no effect on the presentation because it's all contained within a small, a max width media query. So it's never going to affect the display of this. And then furthermore, in most UI frameworks, you would have, for things you only want to show up in certain scenarios, you could have like hidden medium, or maybe you would have visible extra small or visible small or something like that. And you could have sort of a utility class where in this example, we'll just create this on the fly, but this exists in like Bootstrap and Bulma and lots of other UI frameworks. You would have these utility classes that allow you to control the visibility of an element in different media queries. So in this case, if we had a visible small class, we could have a utility class that basically says by default, visible small is display none. But whenever you are in this media query down here, you could have visible small display block. right? So only on small screens is that going to be visible. And now, again, our desktop experience is totally the same as it was before, but we now have an interaction that's totally specific to the small screen experience. And this is a better way to deal with this. If you do this, you won't find yourself doing things like having to override your styles. You won't find yourself doing things like writing JavaScript that has to check media queries and then do something different based on what screen size you're currently in. It's much better to just kind of use media queries to totally segregate the presentation changes to only the screens where that interaction actually matters. And I think that's an important consideration to make. It's not actually something that we necessarily need to do in this case. Like I said, I didn't even plan on doing this, just kind of off the cuff, like let's mess around with stuff. But I do think it's important to kind of demonstrate that, because it's always something, and for whatever reason, specifically with a menu toggle, this is the one where I run into the most, where for whatever reason in the design pattern, people may decide they want like a big old menu on desktops, but when you run out of room, that's the first thing to go, right? Because there's a lot of times your menu can have so much stuff in it. Well, let's just shove that behind a menu button and make it visible somewhere else. And it's a good case to still use your interaction, but don't do anything funky with your interaction. Just kind of change the classes and change the presentation so the classes are still being added and removed even on desktop. Right? So again, we still have active small on desktop. It just doesn't matter because it has no effect to the presentation on desktop. And I think you're going to find that's going to make your job a lot easier. It allows you to be a lot less hacky when you're needing to differentiate an interactive functionality across your different screen sizes. So like I said, I'm just going to take all this stuff out because I didn't plan on doing this stuff. I'm just going to delete that in our... Where else do we change? In the index.html, I'm just going to undo a bunch until we get back to a normal menu here. We'll take out our container. There we go. So I think that's now back to a normal style with our normal drop downs, just like you can see here. But if you want, and if that's something you do find yourself a scenario you find yourself in often, I would recommend taking some time and just practice that. Practice creating interactions that only affect a single screen size or a single media query based on what it is you want to do, because it is a good skill to have. It's a good thing to just kind of stick into your toolbox. And even though I would always recommend try to find an interaction that works across all devices, I know that we all find ourselves in those scenarios from time to time where the design demands or requirements demand that you don't do that. And so that's a good tool to reach for, a good technique to reach for when you do want to accomplish that specific pattern. Okay, great. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much with that one. But the good news is you don't really have to worry about that too much. We're not going to mess with media queries too much in this example. And I think we're going to call these drop downs done for now. We still want to improve those because there's some important accessibility and other features we could add to our toggle to make these drop downs even better. So that's going to be what we look at in the next lesson. So stay tuned and we'll take a look at that in just a few moments.